WNYC TV presents About the Arts with Barbara Lee Diamonstein.
Barbara Lee Diamonstein, and our subject today is architecture, design, and urban life. And our guests are two of the most significant influences on the urban landscape. It's a very special pleasure today to introduce one of the most distinguished architects in the world, I.M. Pei, and to his right, one of the most innovative ones, Peter Eisenman, the mastermind of the Institute of Architecture and Urban Studies. A warm welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Perhaps we should start by talking about what's happening to architecture. Every time I talk to an architect, they are always plunged these days into the deepest of gloom. Do we need architecture anymore? Why are things so bad?
You asking me this question?
I'm asking you both this question. Perhaps we should talk about the wave of the future in urban design. I mean, given the state of urban economics.
Well, let's talk about let's answer the question.
All right, let's
I don't think so bad.
I think you asked the first question. I think it's a temporary situation. I really mean it. I think those of us who live in New York, work in New York, probably feel it more, the impact. Because first we have the recession, then we have the difficulties with the city problems, the city fiscal problems, as well as the state problems. When you put all of that together, it has its telling effect. But I think, I'm an optimist, it's temporary.
No, I agree with I.M. I think that, everybody's been telling me for the last 25 years that architects were becoming increasingly unnecessary. And I've watched the less or the more daunted of our profession scurry away to become computer experts, technologists, programmers, advocates, what have you, running away from something which is in itself very difficult, that is doing architecture. And, I think architecture will survive precisely because there's a real need in everybody's soul, whether they be someone who lives in a farm community, in a ghetto community, in an Upper East Side apartment, the North Pole. There's something that has always been mythological and spiritual about architecture. And I think we all, especially in this time when we're kind of reappraising things because of the fact that a lot of public work doesn't exist, I think feel very good about architecture. I mean,
what's the wave of the future in a city that's going broke? Given the state of urban economics, what can architects and designers do to influence urban life?
Well, first of all, I don't think the city is going to go broke. I'm convinced of that. It won't go broke. And then to answer your second question, I would say that my optimism will have to be qualified. I think there always will be a place for architects, but certain kind of architects. I think architects who are, let's say, who remove themselves from life, I think we'll have a problem. I think as long as the architects stay close to the pulse of life, he will never be obsolete.
Well, what about that non-objective architect, Mr. Eisenman?
Well, I don't think that...
Perhaps you should explain to our audience what I mean when I say that.
I'm not sure.
I'd like to know, too.
I'm certainly not. I'm not sure I know what you mean, Barbara Lee, but if you mean that architecture is seen as abstractions, I believe that poets and painters and writers and people of all of the arts have always been not only in touch, but the thing that makes them closely in touch is the power to abstract from the reality that which is the essence, that's which the joy, whatever it is. So I think what I.M. is saying is you can't be an abstractionist in an ivory tower sort of talking about architecture. You have to be close to clients, to communities, but you also have to have that capacity to abstract, because in the end, what I.M.'s great strength is, the great joy of what he does, is not that the buildings, some people say, those cold prisms, etc., that kind of, anybody can use that metaphorical language. The great joy is that they stand for their monuments of the civilization, of the culture, and they're very warm. You know, they may be built of stone and of glass and of concrete. That building in Boston, for example, is, even though it's of glass, it reflects the whole history of the city. You know, the iconography of the city is wrapped up in it. So who is to say, you know, that abstraction or non-objective is far from people? And I think what I love about being here today and being here with this man, because he represents for me a generation of my elders who are, whatever, we can disagree about styles and tastes, and you know, as writers and filmmakers and painters always do, he's an architect, and he never ran away, and he never gave up, you know, and became something else. He never sold his soul, and he's still there making architecture. And I think, you know, I'm sorry to sound like a preacher. I.M. can't do it for himself. But that's, you know, there are very few I.M. Peys around. And why he's what he is because he still has that vision. All right? And I aspire to that.
The Institute has.
What is
that
the
your
vision?
Institute has, yes. You say that you don't have a generation gap, but you have also identified yourself as an architect of the 70s. Lest the audience think that is boastful, Peter Eisenman has said that about himself in the 50s. What did you mean? What do you mean?
I think what the Institute is trying to do, I think I.M. and I have chosen two different ways of being professional architects. I think we both would stand. I don't consider myself a teacher any more than I consider him a builder. We're both architects. Secondarily, he may be a builder and I may be a teacher. We're trying to create a constituency out there in the general public, an awareness of what architecture is, why it needs to exist, and what it takes to make it come about. In other words, to create some climate of opinion that makes us realize in this country and in this city that what other cities in Europe and other countries have realized for centuries, that one's heritage, one's history, one's culture, one's whole attitude about a public awareness is manifest in its architecture. And that's what the Institute that's why we have a kind of mutual interlocking interest.
Well, it seems particularly striking that there really is no constituency, so to speak, for architecture. Even the most sensitive and aware people take the physical environment for granted. Every now and then they will look up and notice a detail on a building, or a striking Seagram's building, or a CBS building, or some monumental, well-known, well-publicized building. Why have we never developed that kind of constituency, particularly in a public that has become increasingly aware of standards of excellence in other visual arts?
I'm not so sure that's the case. I think that it is true that Americans have less of an opportunity to observe, let's say, what a beautiful quote-unquote environment can be compared with the Parisians or maybe a Londoner, because there they see cities. But I think that I think we're beginning to, we meaning not the architects of America, I think we've gone past that. At least I think we as professionals have come this far. I think we as people are beginning to realize that what makes a city beautiful is not a few beautiful objects like Seagram's. That doesn't make a city.
What does make a city? What's a utopia in New York?
Well, example, of course, is look at Paris. Look at London, right? You have the example. Look at Peking. You've seen Peking now on television a lot. Look at those cities, those three cities. Now you see the ingredients of a beautiful city.
And what are those ingredients? And what do we have to do in New York?
It's a unity. It's a unified whole. The whole city is unified. There's no exceptional work of architecture that you say this is first rate. I don't really know of a great building in Paris that you say, I don't think there's a great office building in Paris that measures up to Seagram's. There's or even CBS. Overall, the city, the ambiance of the totality of the city is there.
Can New York aspire to that, or is it too late?
Not too late, but we have a long way to go.
And how is that accomplished? How do you develop people, first a constituency in the general public and in the government, to be more and more concerned with the environment, the built environment as well?
Well, I wanted to go back and add to something I.M. was saying, because I so agree with him. it has been said of Paris that it's a city of that the outdoor space, the streets, are really the indoor space of Paris, and the walls of the buildings are kind of like the walls of the indoor space. And what you have is an outdoor environment, a public environment, which is not hostile, friendly, that you can live in, and people like sitting in cafes, even in bad weather. Paris, God knows, has its bad weather. I would have thought that if we understood that architecture was not just the design of buildings. I think people in the recently at the City Planning Commission and the Urban Design Group have tried in their new zoning resolutions to try and suggest that the way you get better spaces and a better environment is not just by merely having a certain square foot allowance and a certain height for buildings and FAR ratios and what have you, but really trying to consider not only the use, the kind of activities, multi-use, the kind of space between buildings. I think this is what we're coming to. I mean, as for example, the building in Boston, IAM's building, it's a building which could have been clad in glass in a way which wouldn't have been reflective.
We're talking about the Hancock building.
Yes,
yeah.
which wouldn't have shown off the rest of the city. But here's a building which takes into account the landscape of Boston and tries to reflect it. And I think these are kinds of ideas, rather than each building trying to be its own monument and outdoing another building, which can only lead to a kind of chaos which destroys avenues. You see, in a way, you could argue, no matter for whatever the brilliance of Seagram, that the gesture to break back from the avenue,
the plaza, setback,
was a gesture that in the past maybe public edifices like churches, libraries, civic halls, etc. But here was a liquor company doing it. And the minute you do this, no matter with what quality, you begin to suggest that anybody can do this. And I think we have to be very...
Does that democratize architecture?
I don't know.
Or dilute it?
I mean, we could talk about this, Seagram, because I think it's a dangerous precedent.
In what way?
Well, it destroys just what IAM was talking about, that sense of continuity. Park Avenue, suppose all buildings set back and wiggled about and did all kinds of things on Park Avenue, that sense of that great avenue would have been gone.
But I thought one of the directions that we were going to in our urban fabric is plazas, open spaces. How do you combine the two?
Well, I'll tell you, there are two traditions in modern city planning, I think, and it was really funny. I was talking with Arthur Drexler today, and he said, I imagine 100 years from now when we look at Le Corbusier's planning, which is one of the streams which talks about towers and open spaces, we'll come to think of it as very primitive. And I think that the whole concept of plazas and open spaces with tall buildings kind of set in relief, as opposed to a context of low wall-like buildings, framing spaces, is something that as a stage we've gone through, and I think we're going to go back to something which is very maybe 19th century, 18th century.
Yeah.
You sound like Arthur Drexler in bringing back the Beaux-Arts.
No, I think one of the questions you asked earlier on should be answered. That is, can we do to New York what Baron Haussmann did to Paris? Is it too late? Is it possible? I think it is true that it helps to have an autocratic form of government that happened to be at that time to have a planner or an urbanist that really understands urban architecture to come into the picture and do a significant part of the city. It helps. But it isn't the only condition under which one can create a beautiful city. London, for instance, was built without that autocratic form of government. Entrepreneurial, yes, very definitely. The aristocracy were the developers in those days, 18th century, 19th century. They were the developers. So they have the advantage, and this we have today also, of doing more than just one little block, one little slot within a block. They deal with a large area, a large section of the city. That I think we have too. We have the same advantage. But that I think it needs, it seems to me, Peter, that the architects have to reach a point where they begin to have a common vocabulary and a common understanding of the problem. So that for those who build a building A first, the next one comes along to build a B next to A. He does not try to compete with A, but they begin to complement A.
So you have a positive domino
Then you begin
effect.
to hold hands, you see, and before you know, you have a chain.
Incidentally, is hand-holding the way one architect gets a job from another? How does an architect get a job?
They don't hold hands.
No, I think that No, I think that architects get jobs from other architects. I know that younger architects, again, one of the debts that young architects have always had, and I think this is a kind of tradition. I think there's a kind of feeling that certain architects will always recommend other architects, and it's a kind of thing that carries on. It happens in other countries, and it's very, very much in effect here in evidence.
Let's get back to New York City for a moment. Why is there such an absence of good architecture here? Is it more expensive? Is good architecture more expensive?
I think we have our share of good architecture as a single piece of work. I think I even include Guggenheim, although most people would disagree with that. But it's a terrible piece of urban architecture, but it's an excellent piece of architecture per se. Artists like yourself would probably disagree. You say, gee, my sculpture, my painting would look terrible there. But it's an interesting piece of architecture. We have many in New York. Not as many, perhaps.
I meant contemporary architecture.
Yes, I mean
for
that
example.
too. I think for instance, Seagram's, I think it's as a building, if you don't look at it in terms of urban design, as a single building, it's a very fine piece of, modern architecture.
But that contradicts your earlier theory that you must look at it in its context.
That's right. That's why I say I would like to differentiate mostly for discussion purposes between architecture of a single building versus the architecture of a section of a city.
What other single buildings do you consider to be outstanding, contemporary buildings?
You mean things built since,
Yes.
say, the Second World War, for instance? I think the Ford Foundation building by Roach and Dingaloo is a fine building.
Well, you have to take the Lever House as a
Lever House,
as
yes.
a,
What is
as
the
a
date of
seminal
Early 50s, I think.
Yeah.
early 50s, 53.
Was that our first glass enclosed?
Well, it was not the I think
setback?
the Oregonian building, the Belusky building in Portland was the.
Yes.
in this city, though. I
in
meant.
this city.
Yes, I think it's the first all-glass building. I think more so than the insurance company building
Right.
by Belusky. That one, at least the structural frame is articulated in metal.
That's right.
Whereas this is all glass, where it's a curtain wall, sheer glass. Yes,
That was
it
in a
is.
pre-energy
I think-
conscious America.
But don't you think that what's happened because of this the training of the architect? When we lost, I.M. said something that we don't have a kind of discipline. We don't have anything that can get architect A to talk to architect B in a way that we can understand. And I think what happened, it's partly to do with the educational system, that when we lost the Beaux-Arts training, and no one is not suggesting to go back to that, there was a great...
Nor was Mr. Drexler. I did not want to
there was a
have
great
the audience
void.
misinterpret that
And what
reference.
happens now if you go around to the schools? Nothing has changed since I went to school. They're still doing the same funny little problems with the same funny little solutions, and everybody's learning how to be a mad genius.
Well, how is your institute unique? How does it differ from other schools of architecture? And what is its genesis, its origin, its purpose?
Oh my goodness. Well, that's another 8-hour program, right?
In two sentences.
I can speak a little bit about not the genesis. He'll have to talk about that. It's probably, in my opinion, today in New York, and New York is a big city, a lot of things happen here, probably the center of really very important intellectual activity on the subject of architecture and urban studies.
Well,
It's
how does
going
it
on in New York
differ?
today, right there in this institute.
How does it differ from other schools of architecture?
I'm curious, how does it affect your firm? I'm curious, how does it affect the profession? That would interest me.
First of all, many of our young people who are doing work in our office, who are creating architecture and design in our office, attend your conferences, your seminars.
There's there's an extensive evening.
There is. I didn't know how many architects and young architects went, but I know that.
You find that it has disproportionate, let's say, influence in an office such as ours.
Well, maybe
with
you should be
Columbia,
telling us about
Pratt, Cooper Union, you name it. There are many
about the
others.
Institute's
This is a very
evening
small-
program.
No, I just want to say what we tried to do, and I think why I was interested to hear I.M.'s reaction, is that we all came out of both professional situations and school situations to try and bring the two together, to be a kind of halfway house for bringing professionals together with people who are thinking about architecture, who are not on the direct firing line, and also that bringing together, that confrontation, let's say, or that synthesis, have it done in front of students, and to bring students in who are not professional architectural students. They may be professionals in terms of the fact they're in offices, but they come either in the evening or during the day for what I would consider a broad-based humanist attitude. In other words, to look at architecture not as a professional side, because we have lots of professional schools, but to expose architecture like any other humanist discipline, its cultural heritage, its administrative and social and political implications for a society, to try and bring these concerns out of the professional concerns that IM is involved in every day, that some of the people in his office are, bring them into a broader cultural spectrum, and so that these people from the professional offices can come in contact with the people who in fact are the board members, the council members, the administrator, the new constituency that we're trying to make. So therefore it's an education beamed at a different audience from a different point of view.
It's interesting to hear your areas of agreement. I wonder if you would please distinguish for us between the two of you and your architectural perspectives. How do they differ?
I would say we differ only on, as I see, on one count. I think Peter, because he belongs to his generation, which is to say that when I was a little younger, his generation, I was then doing a little bit of what he was doing now, that he's doing now. I would say that he's much more involved in theoretical speculation, investigation. This is a luxury that I no longer have. Very sad to say that, and in a way has to give way to the younger ones who are able, whose mind is clearer, perhaps not as experienced but clearer, and who is able to get behind or forget about the minutiae of practice, professional concerns, and therefore come to grips with the more abstract aspect of the professional thinking. I think this is very important. It has to be done, and I think that Peter is doing a lot more of that kind of work, let's say, than we are or than I am in my generation.
But if I understand what you've said, the work of his institute does in a way vitalize and make its teachings felt through your firm by the younger people as well.
And in turn, I like to say, you say.
No, I would like to go the in turn. They do.
Yes.
How?
Let me say, I think the times have changed for two reasons. I think we were both victims of circumstances. One is that when IM got out of school and his generation, there were no firms really practicing, or very few practicing, modern architecture. And there was a need for architecture, corporate building, capital investment, government building, housing. You know, there was much room to move. 20 years later when I got out of school, or 15 years later when I got out of school, times had changed, and it wasn't as easy to move and do the kinds of things professionally that you wanted to do. Many of my generation were forced to go into teaching, not because they wanted to, because there were very few other entrees. Secondly, modern architecture, after the war, was still in some ascendant form. Modern city planning, the kinds of ideas that were in existence before the war. We've now experienced 25 years since that time, and we realize those ideas are no longer relevant or even valid. And so there's a period of re-examination. So therefore, I'm involved in that re-examination only because IM says have the time to do that. He, on the other hand, where I get energy from the professional right now, is that you can't be all things to all people. Somebody has got to be out there building those images and those myths that we are thinking about, reevaluating, and assessing. And as I said, without this kind of man, without the kinds of people like himself, who are not just building anything. I mean, there are a difference between architects and builders. I think there may be 3 or 4 architects of his generation in the country.
Let's briefly talk about the next generation of architects. What advice would you give an architecture student today? Peter?
Well, I would advise him first to be patient and that I don't believe anybody becomes an architect until he or she is 40. And I think that we have a long history of, mature in the sense, so there's a long way of learning, way to go. I think they should work, they should travel, they should look, they should do as much with their hands as they possibly can to prepare themselves, but most of all to be patient. I don't know what.
I am.
I think first they should be well-grounded theoretically. And then when they're young, this is the time to do it, to really think about past, present, and future direction of architecture as he sees it. I think that's very important. This is something that each young architect must have before he comes on to practice, let's say, to really begin to take on responsible position of building buildings. I think he should have that solid theoretical grounding in him. And then I think he will have to very quickly begin to come to terms with life. And that does not mean copping out. That doesn't mean making compromises at all. I think then you have to synthesize the two, bring the two together, and then you can begin to move forward. Now, it doesn't mean that when he's young, he should not come to grips with life, but less of a need to do so, I feel. I feel that it's less of a need to do that.
So you're advocating vision.
I think so, and I think that's the time to have it. And I would like to be young again, so to speak. But I think one thing that Peter said, which I think bears repeating a bit, and that is that the difference of the two generations in this case is enormous. When we first came on, let's say in our 30s, after university at that time, we didn't have any of the confidence that they have today. Their confidence was derived from what we have done.
That's true.
Let me ask you both one last brief
You walked
question.
into a void.
We walk into a void. We look at Europe. Trying to look right over the shoulder, but largely to Europe, And they were so distant, and there was nothing here. There are no architects of the next generation, of the older generation, that we can look to with respect.
I should say, that's one of the great things that we did have. They had no daddies. You really didn't.
Good or bad.
In the past 20 years, I.M. Pei and his firm has designed and built more than 50 projects. 34 of them have been award winners. Some of the buildings that Mr. Pei has been closely identified with are the East Building of the National Gallery, the JFK Library in Boston, the master plan for Columbia University. I'm going to ask you both a brief, slightly unfair question just before we leave. What do you consider your most significant single accomplishment?
This is a very interesting question. It's almost like a man who has many children, and you ask him, which one do you like the best?
But it's building.
It's very difficult. Now this may surprise you. I think that looking back, I would look back with a great deal of satisfaction. In the period of the late 50s and early 60s, when we were very much involved in rebuilding cities. And that is not a single building. I can't say it's Kips Bay or Society Hill or University Towers or Government Center in Boston. But that program, which we were fortunate enough to have a part in during that program, it was a very important time. Title I just came on. That, I think, is an interesting period, and I still look back with a great deal of satisfaction at that.
Well, I would be immodest if I were to suggest that any of the buildings that I have done I could look at and say that was my most significant, because my projects are slightly less than significant in their conception. I would think that I would like to answer you, because I do feel that I would like to be a building architect for one reason or another. I don't build as much as I am, and I think both of us share that urge to build and the will to build, and so therefore the only significant thing that the most significant thing is that I decided to be an architect when I was 18 years old.
Thank you, I.M. Pei, Peter Eisman, for being with us. It's a pleasure to have men of such special vision and creative energy. I'm Barbara Lee Diamonstein.